I want to take just a quick minute and introduce our afternoon keynote. And with respect to Ross Mason, founder of MuleSoft, which is pretty much the hottest startup, or one of the hottest startups in the Valley. Ross is solving an issue, solving a problem that is very close to enterprise software and how enterprise software and cloud software interacts, how it works together. If you're interested in enterprise software and how cloud is impacting every single player in the field, this is something you don't want to miss. This is a session that is a must attend for everybody who's looking at enterprise software field today and who's looking at how cloud is impacting enterprise software. I'd like to invite and I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Ross Mason, founder of MuleSoft.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. How are you? That was a pretty heavy lunch, wasn't it? I've got a lot to compete with now to get your attention, I think. So I'm going to talk about MuleSoft, and as the introduction suggested, we play very much in the enterprise realm. But I thought, given that SV Open is a great sort of event for entrepreneurs, I'm going to tell a bit about my story as well, about how I even got into the enterprise, because enterprise startups are a bit different from consumer startups. There's a few more hurdles you need to jump through to make it happen. So I'll talk a bit about my story. But first, I'd like to talk about what it's like to walk amongst giants. And the giants I'm talking about are our competitors. So Oracle, IBM, TIBCO, the big guys that have been doing this for years. And also our customers, which is really the global 1,000. So the Amazons, the Ciscos, the Starbucks of the world are all using our software to connect things together. So let's start with the problem definition. The world today quite literally has exploded in the number of digital assets and where data resides. So if we look at it, there's over 2,000 SaaS applications out there. In Silicon Valley, we're fairly in tune with what SaaS means to businesses. We have Salesforce here, we have Workday here, but SaaS is really transforming businesses globally. So a lot of the business we do in Europe and in Asia is actually helping companies connect SaaS applications back into their IT assets. Remember, the biggest challenge for enterprises is really they've spent decades building up value inside their data center, and now suddenly things are starting to move outside of the data center, and they're trying to figure out how to connect it all. The other thing that changed is there's so much data now. I'm not going to talk too much about this. There's many big data companies out there. But from our purview, data is another big challenge, because this data, not only is there a lot of it, but it lives in many more places than it ever used to. So connecting that data has become critical even before you can think about finding insights in that data. And then finally, and the big exciting one in the Valley right now is devices. 50 billion devices by 2020. I think there's probably more than that, because I'm talking to companies who are connecting light bulbs, they're creating Wi-Fi-enabled clothing, apparel. They're thinking all of these different ways of actually connecting devices to the physical world so that they can gather data and provide better services to consumers. And that's really what the Internet of Things is all about. It's not about the things. It's about capturing that data and then delivering that data in some sort of value to a consumer. So for example, Nest thermostat helps us not only control our home remotely, which isn't really what we need to do, but it does help you reduce your energy bill by 20% by being a bit smarter about how you heat your home. If you think about insurance, so Progressive have this thing called Snapshot. Snapshot plugs into your car and records how fast you move, how fast you brake, what kind of driver you are. And then they're using that data to reduce your premium. Or in my case, they're going to increase my premium because I'm not a very good driver. But devices really matter in the enterprise as well. It's not just a consumer thing. And in fact, really where you're going to see IoT explode is in manufacturing, in logistics, in the travel industry, anywhere where there's machinery. IoT is making a massive impact today. So what do we do as MuleSoft? Well, simply, our goal is to connect everything everywhere. So your systems, applications, and devices. And that's a pretty big goal. And I think we've reached the size of an organization where we can take on that goal. But it didn't always start there. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we got started in the second half of this presentation. So what does it mean to connect everything? Well, 15 years ago, connecting things in the enterprise, and this is the enterprise picture if you like, meant connecting databases, applications, the ERP systems, really the assets that control the data inside enterprises. And the big guys like Oracle, IBM, TIBCO, WebMethods, and a bunch of others were really focused on just connecting things within the four walls of the data center. And then something interesting happened. All the interesting stuff moved out of the data center and into the cloud. And increasingly, the lines of business preferred these cloud-based or SaaS-based applications to run their lines of business with. And now what we're seeing in IT is companies actually have to have a strategy around SaaS in order to connect those applications back into their assets they have on premise. And that was the first wave. And now what's happening is these same companies are looking, how do I connect other devices, other types of information into this landscape? And suddenly you've gone from connecting maybe 50 to 200 systems to connecting thousands. And that's the connectivity challenge, and that's the thing that we solve. There's another problem. IT in every organization, think of anyone in the Fortune 1000, they have probably a couple of decades of assets they've built up over time. And with assets, as anyone knows, it slows you down. Your ability to change anything in that type of organization is a real challenge because essentially things are very much related to each other. We sort of layer on complexity after complexity in any complex IT system. And there's this well-defined $1 trillion innovation gap that's happening right now in organizations where the CIO is asked to make a change that the business wants to make, but they can't implement that idea fast enough because it takes too long. And that's because they haven't set up their infrastructure the right way to be able to connect to more things rapidly and compose things more easily. And this is the problem we solve for our customers. So we take this big mess here, so all the jumble of things that people connect together today and all the things they're looking to connect to tomorrow, and we keep a unified platform for putting all those things onto one single infrastructure. That's a logical infrastructure, so for the IT guys in the room, that's not just one piece of software, but it's a platform. And that platform enables a new level of innovation that really wasn't possible a few years ago. And it's not just thanks to us, but it's us plus the new assets, the things like the SaaS applications, the devices, the new B2B models from, affiliate models from other companies. Being able to connect all together sparks a whole new set of possibilities inside organizations. And that's really what we're doing with our platform. And these are some of the companies that we work with. So one thing of interest in MuleSoft is we're very horizontal. We didn't focus on any one vertical. My background was financial services, so we started there. But very quickly we realized the requirements for moving data between systems and applications in financial services mapped really well to healthcare, and it mapped very well to telco and insurance and logistics and travel. It turns out everyone has the same problem, and it's how quickly can I connect things together to drive more value to my consumers or to my partners? And that's what a business really does. It collects assets, and then it figures out how to make them available. So just one final piece on how we got here. So when MuleSoft started, and I'll talk about the journey in a minute, but we started solving a problem in the enterprise. And if you think about the enterprise as a set of assets that they build up over time, that's their operational data and systems, their customer information, their product information, their supply chain management systems. Those are all the assets that companies build up so that they can execute on a business initiative, and the better they do it, the more value they provide in the marketplace. And what we did in the early days was just help them connect those systems. So we were competing with the big guys, and the reason we won there was because we were lightweight, we were easier, we had a better methodology for actually connecting systems rapidly, and we thought about the whole life cycle. Then what happened, if there's any architects in the room, this notion of service orientation happened in the enterprise. And this is where people started creating services in the organization. All the services, by the way, for the non-technical, is a way of accessing a resource within the enterprise through a well-defined interface, if you like, a point at which I can get that service. And the whole driver for that was to start decoupling information silos so other parts of the organization could access that data so they could start driving innovation in their own projects. You can imagine a big stifle for innovation in any organization is not having access to the data. If it takes you 4 months to get the data, you're not going to drive any type of innovation, and everything you do is a heavyweight integration project. So this second layer really helped to free things up. But what's happened now, and I'm going to talk about this at the end more, is there's a new way of looking at this problem that is connecting the business to IT. And the catalyst for this is APIs, the application programming interface. Actually, I'm not quite sure of the audience. So when I say API, does everyone know what I mean? Can I go a quick show of hands? Okay, over half. That's good. So for the other half, think of an API as just a channel that delivers value from one person to another. In this case, a value from the enterprise to their consumer. The details don't really matter, but the whole point of the API is how do I take the assets outside of my organization and deliver them to consumers in the format they want. And you all know what this is because every one of those apps on your mobile phone that from your banking provider or your insurance provider, that's a channel. That's them getting data out of their very legacy on-premise system. So if I want my Geico policy on my phone, that phone app talks to the back-end systems inside that organization, gets that data out and delivers to you on your phone. The user experience of that is now suddenly you're more connected to your insurance provider and they can provide you new levels of service that they couldn't do before the phone. And what's happening with APIs, this new channel delivery, means that people can think very differently about the type of services they can deliver to their consumers or to their partners. And this is a pretty exciting time for the enterprise and actually for people who want to actually innovate in the enterprise because now we've got a model that we know works to free up those assets and deliver those assets in unique ways to create new value to our consumers. So that might all sound pretty big. There's a lot that we do now that 10 years ago we weren't doing. So I want to talk a little bit about how it all got started, because something like MuleSoft is a very long journey, and most people in the Valley have probably only heard about us in the last 2 years. But there was another 8 years before that where nobody cared. So, and the way it gets started for me, and this is almost a word of advice for entrepreneurs, is when you think about starting a new company, I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs that they look at hot spaces in the market and they say, I'm going to go and do something in consumer healthcare because that's really hot right now. I'm going to do something in, or usually it's a dating app actually for consumers. They seem to do quite well too. But if you don't have the passion for really solving that problem, if it's not something that keeps you awake at night, there's something that every day you're thinking about, you go out for dinner with your partner and she's saying something to you, and you realize at some point you switched off because you're thinking about your idea. That's when you know that's a good idea, when you can't even hold a conversation, right? So my idea back then was I was working in financial services, and I was architecting systems for trading, so investment banking. And I couldn't believe how painful it was to connect just 7 systems together inside a bank. And it was painful for all sorts of reasons. It was painful because the bank wasn't very well organized, there was a lot of politics. It was also painful because the big vendors were taking our CIOs out on yacht trips and golf tours and things like that, and then getting to buy software that they'd never vetted that would actually solve the problem that we were trying to solve. And I was on the receiving end of that, of those wonderful software deliveries from IBM and Oracle. And I was just very frustrated. I really wanted to make it work inside the bank, and I was having a very hard time because all the tools that we purchased to make it easier, I was working against them. And I got kind of obsessed with this notion that everything was broken, that, that the enterprise vendors were not even incentivized to help us, because once they made the sale of the software, they didn't care whether we used it or not. That seemed fundamentally broken. You should care about my success, not making a sale. And so when I created MuleSoft, it wasn't just about the software, it was actually the business model. We changed that as well. But the way it got started was this idea was burning in my head that the software at least could be a lot easier. And I felt like as a developer, in the whole trying to actually make this stuff work, I felt like I at least had a good opinion on what I would want available to me to build this type of distributed system inside a bank. So what I did, I started a project called Mule. And Mule was just an open source project, and open source back then in 2003 was sort of taking off. It's a bit different today than it was back then. Back then you would find enthusiasts that really cared about things. And I just went out and I found a few guys that cared about the problems I was dealing with and tried to get them to use my product. And over time, you build it up. But there is time. I mean, it took a year and a half, I think, before anyone really even cared about what I was doing then, which, again, was a little frustrating. But the key thing here is to start, you can start very small. You don't have to say, I'm going to connect the world's application systems and devices on day one. But you solve a problem, and you pick a problem that you know has broad enough appeal, or that you know enough about and believe you can build a credible business, and that's a great place to start. Then, of course, anyone in the Valley knows that enterprise got sexy recently with the likes of Box and Aaron Levy building up his company. In reality, though, I think we've been termed one of the sexy enterprise companies. The enterprise is anything but sexy. There's no sex in the enterprise, simple as that. What there is a lot of hard work. And the reason I say this is the notion of the enterprise being sexy is really from an investor standpoint. They like it because there's money in enterprises, and they will spend money if you can give them something of value. The challenge is, it's very hard to do that in a 2-year period. When you're thinking about an enterprise startup, you're thinking about 4 to 10 years, minimum. So you've really got to care about that idea. So going back to that passion again, if you don't care about it enough, you're not going to make it, and you'll just waste 3 years of your life. So, enterprise, I love enterprise. I've always loved it, but my passion has never waned on connecting things. It just so happens that now the world needs to connect even more. But even if we didn't need to, I'd still care about that problem. And that's why probably MuleSoft was the right thing for me to do. But don't be sort of sucked in with the TechCrunch's articles about how great enterprise startups are. It really is hard work. And everyone I meet, I tell them the same story, is that if you're not going to be doing this for the next 5 years, if you really think this is going to be a 2-year thing, don't do it. Because there's not a single enterprise startup anyone's ever heard of that did anything in 2 years. Also, there's always a way. There is always a way, and every founder will say this. If you've really got an idea and you've got the passion, you can find a way to do it. My caveat on that is, there is always a way, but you've got to see the broader picture. There's a way to do something once, but can you scale it? Because enterprise is actually all about scaling. It's about selling something to multiple enterprises. And what most startups fall in the trap of is they serve 1 or 2, and they never get any further. And then they just burn out because they're building stuff for Cisco, or they're building stuff for HP, or they're building stuff for JP Morgan. So when I think about enterprise startups and I look at the business models that people come up with, I'm always looking at how does this scale out, either to a vertical or more broadly. And there is always a way, but if you don't understand how it's going to scale, then you may not want to do it. It's as simple as that. The other one, which I love, is the tenacious never give up. And I've got a caveat on this one as well. So it's true you should not give up, but there are 2 reasons why you should give up. One, if you lose your passion, I'm going to go back to that again. If 3 years in you get to a point where it doesn't feel like you can do it, that's maybe a good reason to give up. And I'll give you an example of this. When we started MuleSoft, I'll give you the timeline. I started the project in 2003. I founded the company in 2006. And then 2008, the economy melted down, especially financial services where we were. And we became the living dead of companies. It was pretty awful because we had a good business model. Our business model was subscription-based, which meant every year, even if we didn't write any more software, we'd probably make about $4 million, which isn't a bad investment on 12 million from investors to keep going. So they weren't, they didn't say to us, hey, we should shut you down. But it was a testing time for me because it was so difficult that year. Because by the way, when things crash, it's not the market that crashes, it's everything else around you at the same time. So, execs in your company start losing faith and they go elsewhere. You start losing engineers. You start losing your hair. It's a pretty sobering time, but it's great to go through it because it forces you to test your will to make this work. And I will be honest, there was times where I thought maybe I should just shut this down. Maybe this isn't the right timing. We were 2 or 3 years in. We hadn't really proved out a business model. We'd made some sales, but that was it. And maybe we weren't on the right path. I found myself every night asking that question. But then one day I realized I still believed in it, and you can't carry on. And I believed in it because we had data. And this is the second point. You should never give up, but you should always be collecting data. You should always understand what are the things inside your market that determine the reasons why you might or might not be successful. And you follow that data religiously. So our data at the time was we had a cluster of banking customers that were using our products. They're willing to pay money, and we could upsell them every year about 30%. So it's a good upsell ratio. Not only that, but we also had downloads. So we had an open source project and people were downloading our software. So they were registering and downloading more and more frequently. So despite the depression, things were moving in the right direction from a number standpoint. And that was another good reason to keep going. But what I would say is never give up blindly. There are reasons why you should. And one is the data says you should give up, or you don't believe in the idea as much as you used to. Those are the two reasons. So that's, in a nutshell, what we do and how we got started, at least how I think about entrepreneurship in the enterprise. I want to talk, my last part of my session is really about what's the opportunity in the enterprise for everyone right now. And this is a really interesting time. I've been in enterprise software for about 15, 16 years, and I've never seen the market in such a volatile but opportunistic lens as I do right now. And what's happening is there's a whole new economy happening, and it's been driven by this notion of APIs, those things I talked about earlier. So every phone on your app talks to an API on the back end. Increasingly, more services that your bank provides you comes through APIs through third parties. So people are figuring out how to deliver more services to the consumer in better ways, more cheaply, and more rapidly. And it's all been driven by this catalyst of APIs, this notion of creating a channel between your assets and the consumers of those assets. It's nothing new, but we've now started to figure out how to do that well and at scale in the enterprise. So let's talk about what that is. So I call this the API economy. And what it says simply, and I can't even read it on my screen, it's so small here, but APIs are really the business channels between two parties. And those two parties can be anything. It can be the enterprise and you and your insurance company. It can be the insurance company and the brokers. It can also be the insurance company and their developers internally. And this goes back to that internal innovation. You drive internal innovation by unlocking data so you give people access. And I have this conversation, I should share this, with CIOs quite a lot saying, we have a real innovation problem. And some of them have actually said that we have trouble hiring the right people. And it's not really a people problem. If you go into any enterprise, no matter how old or how legacy, there's people in there with good ideas. What hinders those ideas from coming to fruition if there's no path to see those ideas through? And APIs internally, unlocking data within enterprises, provides a path, a light at the end of the tunnel for people within the enterprise to access data and start to realize some of their ideas internally. So it's not necessarily about the people you hire, but it's also about the environment you create in which they can actually innovate. So these innovation channels, they matter for the consumer, they matter for the company itself, and it matters for their partners. Now, the API economy, if I was to define it, is really just the global sum of digital transactions between these two parties. So it's pretty huge. Think about how many digital transactions there are out there today. I mean, everything is moving more that direction. And interestingly, every time a new API comes out, usually what it also does is eradicates a human processing step. Because what you're doing is you're making the data available in a format that's useful to a consumer, and the consumer then interacts directly with you. So you're taking out that human step required to connect that, so think about, I'm going to use insurance again. Think about insurance policies. Insurance policies is still really manual. Even with my bank today, I had to fill something out recently by form. It doesn't make any sense. That should just be a digital channel whereby they already have my data available in one part of the bank, make that data available to me in the other part of the bank. Or when you call your insurance company and they ask you to put in your policy number, and then they ask you to tell them the policy number again. All that is just a function of those two systems are not talking to one another. It's frustrating, but those are the things, those micro changes that start to make a difference in everyone's lives. But the awesome thing about APIs, and this is where it's really exciting, is they enable a new way of thinking about how to interact with your consumers or your customers. You can start thinking about the business models very differently because suddenly that transaction, because it's automated, means you can monitor it in new ways. And I'm going to talk, I won't dig into this too much, but every new startup that I speak to usually have an interesting business model. They've figured out a way of doing something that you couldn't do 2-3 years ago. And that's another critical success factor for startups is also not just making something easier or better, but actually innovating on the business model. And I think in this new economy of APIs where more and more transactions run over the web and through these APIs, the real sort of innovation is going to happen in the business models. So I'm going to use some examples. I won't say any more about that, but it's pretty interesting. And we can see some signs of this happening in major enterprises today already. So I was looking at the Fast Company's list of innovative companies in 2013. And there's some interesting ones here that you might not expect. So you probably might not think Ford would be that innovative. And why is Coca-Cola innovating? And what about Target? They sell us low-cost goods. Why are they driving innovation strategies? Well, simply, these are successful companies, but they're also feeling the change in the market and the need to respond as a great pressure on the organization. And what's also happening is their traditional business models are eroding. So the way they used to do things is not the way things will be done in future. So they've got to change or die. I mean, you remember what happened to Kodak or Blockbuster? Or there's and 1,000 other ones you can't even remember anymore because they just don't matter in this new economy. And the lessons are on the wall, and these guys are looking at ways of driving new types of innovation inside their organization. So let's take Coca-Cola, for example. Any idea why they would have an API? Any idea? What? Partly true, advertising. So Coca-Cola's old business model is to get you to drink sugar water, right? And they do that with a great brand in the marketplace, and then they hit you with that brand again and again and again until you identify with it. Simple as that. What's happening is more of those eyeballs are going online, and they're not going to the traditional places. They're spending more time in Facebook. They're spending more time in applications. And Coca-Cola are under pressure to figure out, how do I keep engaging with my audience, the under 25s, and advertise to them? And we saw this a few years ago in gaming, right? So if you've ever played any of the games on Xbox or PlayStation, you'll see that there's placed advertising in those games now. I actually met the guy who did that the first time around. He's a brilliant guy. He figured out that these digital worlds that we have are also a place where people live now, and engaging with them at that level. And by the way, that strategy of putting advertising in games is driven by APIs. Because what happens is those games call out to APIs and to find out what are the advertising elements they should render on screen. And there's something in the background that's selling these advertising spaces in virtual worlds, in games. So For Coca-Cola, what that means is they've got to figure out how they play in this new realm where they've got to get eyeballs in front of people. So they're building APIs tied directly to their brand around loyalty. Loyalty is a big one. Have 3 drinks, buy another one. They're also innovating on the vending machines. So the vending machines are now connected. They have this thing called Freestyle that allows people to take all their ingredients and mix and match and then figure out the Coke product that they like. They can get the regular one, but they can also play around with it. So they're trying to drive more engagement. Those Coke machines connect back into their corporate systems. And interestingly, they do 2 things. One is there's a loyalty program associated with that, so you have a Coke ID now, which you never had before. But 2, it's actually market research. The more people that do the same combinations helps them understand the flavors that people are responding to. So no longer are they've actually outsourced or crowdsourced their market research for taste, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot of good side benefits in getting things connected. And all of these companies are trying different ways of engaging their consumers in new ways. But of course, it's not just about the bigger guys. I'm pretty sure you would know of all of these companies on this slide. You've got Stripe there that is revolutionizing payments, and Square doing the same thing. You've got Expedia. I don't know if you know this, but Expedia, basically, I would imagine that probably about 80% of the travel bookings you do online go through Expedia. You don't have to go to their website. They have a great affiliate API that means that every other hotel or car rental place or any kayak, everything else, they all talk directly to Expedia's affiliate API to book travel. And it means you get a slice and they get a slice. But they're now making 1,000 more bookings than they were when they were just a single destination. So that's the other value of APIs, is that you start building value around your organization. It's no longer just about you. It's about you and your friends. And they run half their business through that. New Relic is, you may not know these guys, but they're another enterprise play that have really just revolutionized the way you manage systems in the enterprise. And they've just done it very simply by pushing everything as a service. So basically a SaaS management offering. And they're going to go IPO in the next 18 months. And they're going to kill it because this problem, which wasn't possible to solve any other way, and they figured out a way thanks to looking at the web and also making that available through APIs. Because now what happens is every new person that comes on with an application plugs into New Relic. They've become so big that people want to plug into them. Same way as Expedia. So this notion of, it's not just about what I build, it's about what I allow other people to build is really important. Other ones there, Uber, I don't think I need to explain Uber to anyone. It's just really changed the way we think about getting from A to B. Nest, obviously, is pretty interesting. I mentioned that earlier. Amazon is kind of the king of this. Their APIs, they had affiliate APIs before anyone else. They obviously have Amazon Web Services. They're really the king of cloud. I mean, any new startup that starts today starts on Amazon. And they all do it through their API. And what the API is really is just a self-serve model for engaging with consumers or partners. It's as simple as that. So the last sort of takeaways for my session, if I was going to give advice to entrepreneurs, and I'm sure there's some in here who are thinking about doing something in enterprise right now. The first thing is there's no quick flips in the enterprise. You're not going to do something in 2 years and get it done. You might get bought by Google if you do something a little bit interesting, but you won't create a credible company in 2 years. The business model really matters. So building based on value versus what a lot of people tend to do is commodity. I'm going to do this, but I'm going to make it cheaper. And cheaper only lasts for about 18 months, and then you run out of runway. You've got to be building value. And that's the same actually for non-enterprise startups as well. Think about not how to do something people are doing today, but also think about how they're going to want to do it tomorrow and then give them a path to get there. My slide where I had the 3 tiers, integration was first, then service orientation, and then new channels. If I'd started with new channels 5 years ago, I'd be dead now. You've got to give people a path to get to where you want them to get them to. And if you don't know the path, that's fine, because you figure that out as you go along as well. What else did I say here? Because I can't read it on my slides. Experience actually matters. So I did a talk down at Stanford. They have an enterprise group down there. And a lot of these guys were thinking about just going and doing a startup right out of college. They're sort of on their senior year, and they're all thinking about their ideas about what to do next. And it's amazing. If you're going to go into anywhere where domain experience is required, you've got to go and get some experience. Because when I'm talking to enterprises, if I had no idea how enterprises worked, I couldn't sell to them. I can't sell to them because I can't identify with their problem. And in which case, I can't articulate a good solution for them. All I'm offering them is something that may be of interest. So I think experience really matters. I think this is particularly a big problem in the Bay Area. We get a lot of people coming right out of college and going and doing startups. And I think it's a really good experience and it's a fun thing to do, but I would treat that as like your year out. You know, when I went to college, people went traveling for a year. I think here people go and do a startup for a year and then they go and get a job. But getting that experience is really important. And then finally, and this is especially true of enterprises, stand your ground. You are the expert of what you're doing. And when I go into an enterprise and you get some, somewhat aggressive people there who will sort of look at you and say, why do I need this in my organization? Why would I ever trust you to run my transactions? And you've got to have an answer for it. You've got to believe in what you do. You've got to have that passion. And ultimately, you need to stand your ground and say, this is the right way to do it. Are you with me or are you not? And that's really what people buy. When I sell now, I'm actually just not selling the software. I'm just selling the vision of what we do. And that's what people buy into. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. And I'm also going to make one final thing. If you want to know more about this topic and how enterprises are getting successful doing this today, so people like Salesforce, Box, Tesla, who I can't talk about, but they'll talk about at this event. We do have a Connect event happening in San Francisco on the 27th to 29th. I'd love to see some of you there. Thank you.
So folks, we have 10 more minutes for any questions, and I have Adnan here with one microphone on this side of the room. There's one more mic going on to this side of the room. So if you raise your hand, if you have questions, now's the time to go do it. There's one. Okay.
Thank you for this. This has been very informative. So I'm with an anti-malware company that sells to industrial control systems, so electric utilities, similar type of enterprise space. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, you talked about this a little bit, and this is connected to your last point. Can you talk about getting your first early customers and how difficult it was or what challenges were and the challenges that you overcame, how you overcame those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first customer is always the hardest. I mean, as you know, and then the second one gets a bit harder. And with us, my first customer was actually a bank, JP Morgan, and they hired me in as a consultant to help with their architecture, and then I plugged my software into their architecture. I told them what I was doing, and we negotiated through it, but I probably spent about 9 months with them. So getting that first deal. And this is the thing about standing your ground. It's very easy when you get that first deal to then only focus on JP Morgan. In this case, that was the first one I worked with. But I realized it was much more critical to get them sufficient and then move on. And the way I got them sufficient really was leaving them doing enough evangelism inside the organization that I thought that the product would stick. And they're actually instrumental in me raising funding afterwards, because they actually would tell our investors that they would pay money for this. And nothing gets investors more excited than a big bank saying they want to pay for something. So they were the first customer, and then I probably worked very hard for about 6 months after that to get another 4 or 5. And then it starts to get a little easier as you start seeing some patterns. There's a guy over there.
My name is Shoaib. I'm an entrepreneur, and we are working application for consumers and enterprises to have a new vision for how they trade their devices and also secure their data. And what would you recommend, like how we test the water? I mean, we already spoke with many enterprises. They're very interested in looking to our solution and adopting that. And obviously, like you mentioned, the adoption time is kind of long. Period is longer compared to consumers. And we already spoke with like big companies like CNN and other enterprises. Are they interested? But any advice on that?
Yeah. So the question really is, how do you get started? Once you're having those conversations, how do you get them to become a customer? I think that's a big hurdle. And what you'll find in the enterprise is you'll get a lot of interest because enterprises have a lot of people and they're all looking to do things. But the challenge is finding the people that have the influence in the organization to make it happen, right? So I speak to a lot of people who say we're talking to X, Y, and Z. Talking, honestly, in the enterprise is very, very cheap because there's just thousands of people trying to figure out what to do next, and there's a lot of people trying it from different angles. So what we do is we look for champions. We have this notion of a developer champion and then an exec champion. And developer champion is the guy that loves the software and is just getting everyone excited internally about using it. The exec champion actually has an initiative and has some control or full control over the selection process of buying that software. And when you're small, it's hard. But this is why I would focus on just a couple versus going too broad and figure out who those are, work that organization. I literally went to JP Morgan and I worked out their offices for 3 months. And that, that's and in the meantime, when I wasn't doing their stuff, I was still working on my stuff, but that's what I had to do. And not saying everyone has to do that, but if you think about this software, it runs in the heart and lungs of people's organizations. It runs the transactions. So I had to really invest in them getting comfortable with me and the software. And you kind of need to do the same thing. It's very hard to short circuit that process. But I will say, don't use conversations as a good metric of whether there's interest. You've got to really, again, stand your ground and figure out whether they're really going to do something or not, because there's also a missed opportunity cost. If you spend too long on one organization that aren't going to do anything, or you're speaking to the wrong person, that will cost you. And that will cost you all the way through the life cycle of your company, in fact. We still have a lot of conversations internally about that.
My name is Omar Inam. I have a comment and a question. Sorry. Hi, Ross. My name is Omar Inam. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that I'll be at the MuleSoft Connect in 2 weeks.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Good.
The question is, you talked about your competition like IBM, Oracle, TIBCO, web methods. In this space, who you think is the closest competitor that you have right now?
Well, they're all close. I mean, it's not like they went away because we started doing this. And honestly, the big guys have a lot of big relationships with the big companies, and quite often we're arguing against free software from IBM versus paid software from us. But amazingly, because of all these pressures of there being more SaaS inside the organization, the need to innovate inside the organization, they're willing to pay for something new. So we compete with them, but if we can find the companies that have really made that mental leap from we've got to change the way we're doing things from the way we're doing it now, otherwise we may not be around in the next 10 years, those are the perfect customers for us. And that's where we win. If they're still very much thinking the way they did 2 or 3 years ago, then we have a much harder time of winning. So that's actually one of the qualifications we have for our customers is, are they doing something some sort of transformation, or are they doing a smaller project?
So we are running into the last minute of the session. That's the last question you have pretty much at this point. Go ahead.
Hi, great presentation. I want to ask you about, you made a point about selling on value, but that's on the selling of the product to the customer. What I'm finding is a very dangerous trend on the enterprise side, where aggressive vendors are coming and selling into the enterprise with the idea of making it more and more efficient, and tools are replacing people. But the problem is that the CIO is having a harder and harder time convincing the CFO to keep the budgets. And then the problem becomes that when the company wants to move into a different market or they want to bring in different types of tools, they don't have the workforce to support that. So what do you do in your sales cycle to inculcate a culture of productivity rather than efficiency?
Yeah, that's a long topic actually, but I'll try and condense it. So the notion of selling in value versus commoditization is exactly that. If you just make things cheaper, then what happens is people start to lose their budgets because they can run things with obviously less budget over the year. What we do very early on is is for certain types of accounts, not every account, we'll identify if there's really a transformation project going on. Once there is, then we have a lot, more work to do to figure out what they're really trying to do and what's going to happen first. And this is enterprise selling. It's not like, unfortunately, we're not the Atlassians where, they proudly tout they don't have any sales guys. We have a huge sales organization. And it's their role really to help the customer understand and sometimes challenge the customer, and this is, again, stand your ground, on how you should be thinking about the problem. And quite often they'll say, I just need to get this one thing done, and that's all I have budget for. And we'll say, well, the problem is once you get that done, what next? And then what's after that? And you force them to keep thinking about the problem and start to make an internal argument to the business around why they need to be thinking about a different sort of budget for any given project. The other thing we do, which I think works quite well, is because we're subscription-based, we have this notion of, our mantra actually is land, success, expand. So land is, we can do smaller deals, but we're always having the bigger conversation with them. We get them successful while we're having those conversations, and then we expand in the accounts once they've seen the value and can easily make a business case. And I think that works very well in the enterprise because there's a lot of risk aversion right now of putting very large projects in place because so many have failed over the last 15 years that people are starting smaller and growing more gradually. And the great thing is MuleSoft's business model supports that very well. The other guys, not so much, because they live in the old world.
Well, on behalf of the open audience here, I want to thank Ross, and I'd welcome you to join in thanking Ross for this session today.
Thank you.